Greetings. Welcome to this discussion on the Ten Commandments as a political theology. Today we're going to talk about support systems for every individual in society. We're going to talk about support systems that give protection, support, and love. We're going to talk about these systems being delivered primarily, if not solely, through the family when the commandment was recorded. And so we're going to look at two commandments as we look at these support systems. The two commandments are, honor your father and your mother, and you shall not commit adultery. Because these two commandments address the same issue, they're going to be yoked together. So let's look at the first of those two commandments. The commandment is, honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. This commandment assumes, and so it doesn't say it in the beginning, that the role of the parents or the role of the family is to provide protection, support, and love for children. Parents are to protect from the elements, from wild animals. They are to keep the child safe. Parents are to support their children as they grow and as they mature and as they begin to explore ways in which to live life. And parents are to love their children no matter what their children do. That is the assumption of what happens. If not perfectly, it is still the assumption and the expectation. In response for parents providing protection, support, and love, children are to honor their parents. That means children are to be obedient. Children are to listen. Children are to do what their parents want them to do. Children are to practice behaviors that are pleasing to their parents. Because of everything their parents do for them, children are to respond in appropriate ways. Now, over the years, this commandment has been interpreted by many to mean this commandment was written for young children, for toddlers, for children as they're growing, for teenagers, across the board. This is what you're supposed to do. And I can tell you as a father, that's the way I wanted to interpret this commandment. But the scholars say that's not why the commandment was written. It was not written for young children. Rather, scholars tell us that the commandment was written for adult children. Or more specifically, for adult children whose parents were aging, whose physical and mental health was diminishing. And there was this great temptation upon these adult children, or at least some of these adult children, that as their parents were getting older, to ignore their parents and maybe even abuse their parents. And so the commandment was written to admonish adult children that they were always responsible to listen, to respond positively, to do behaviors pleasing to their adult parents because of all of the things their parents had done for them all of their lives. Now, why do scholars believe that? Well, let me give you three reasons. The first, in the ancient world, children were completely dependent upon their parents. Their parents could do anything they wanted with basically the approval of everybody else in society, from how they punished their children, how they taught them, how they led them. And with that kind of strict rules and with parents with all of that authority, it seems rather silly that somebody would have to say to a young child, now you better listen. The child knew that. Writing it to young children did not make sense in the culture in which the commandment was written. What surprises many people is that it's not until the middle of the 20th century that the word adolescence is used for a growing stage in life. In the ancient world, young children were given tasks according to their physical size and mental ability, and as they grew, the tasks and the chores increased in size and in complexity. And as they were entering their teenage years, the children became adults. They became full-time workers in keeping the sheep or minding the fields. There wasn't this time of rebellion, of running away or doing anything else. There were no schools to attract their attention or other activities. So again, we reason the commandment couldn't have been written for teenagers. It just doesn't match the culture of the day. But then, adult children. As the parents grow older and older, they can ignore them. And so now the commandment is written for them. It might be fair at this point to ask, so why is the family so important? Why does it have such prominence as the support system in the ancient world? Well, I'd like to turn to Maslow's hierarchy of needs as an explanation. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs go like this. On the bottom rung of 5 rungs, food, nourishment is absolutely essential. From day one, we need to be fed. We need to be nourished. We know the consequences of malnourishment on the physical body and also on the mental and psychological development of individuals. And so the family was responsible to make sure that young children, middle-aged children, older parents, everyone would have food. It was an essential part of life. Now, Maslow tells us that once we have enough food, we don't have to be very heavy and overeat, but once we have enough food, we need to have shelter. We need to have safety. And so the family goes around building huts or houses or pitching a tent to protect from the weather. It provides safety from wild animals, other things that would threaten a child's life or the family's life or aging adult life. And we really don't have security until we have the first level of food and nourishment and the second level of shelter and safety. The third level in Maslow's higher of needs is love and belonging. And it is in this level that values, attitudes, lifestyles, the norms of society, and religious faith is taught. The families become instrumental in preparing a child or any adult to go into society and to fit within that society. I have always been caught that the Protestant reformers in the 1500s wrote catechisms, not necessarily for adults, but for children. And the catechisms were given to fathers, especially fathers, to teach the faith to their children. Once the children have learned the norms, the values, the attitudes, the lifestyles, the faith of their society, the faith of the people of God, if you will, they move to the next stage, which is called self-esteem. And in self-esteem, we like ourselves. We see that we can be good. We see that we have value. That we can see that we have purpose. In a sense, self-esteem is confidence building. And then finally, Maslow says the self-actualization. We push the envelope. We push the ceiling to be all that we can be. We sometimes transcend some of the boundaries that were put before us. Now, if you look at this triangle with its 5 levels, all of these things happen in the family, and especially in the family in the ancient world. And so Israel thought it was important enough to record the commandment that children were to honor their fathers and their mothers as a way of supporting a system that provided protection, support, and love. The Reformers expanded the commandment. And the Reformers expanded the commandment by asking the question, are there those in society, especially as we're beginning to build cities, and especially as we're beginning to build urban areas, that assume part of a parent's responsibility? And their answer was yes. And so the Reformers said that this commandment not only applies to biological parents and biological children, but it also includes preachers. And it includes teachers. And it includes civil leaders such as mayors, princes, and kings. Now, take a look. The preacher, in many ways, becomes the father of a congregation. The preacher's job is to protect, to support as people grow in faith, and to love them as they take 2 steps forward and then maybe a step back. Preacher is the parent of a congregation, parent in the church. Teachers, in the time of the Protestant Reformation, when this was written, were primarily teachers of children in the church, and they taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was very important for students to learn to read if they were going to read the Bible. Now, academics and teaching was usually reserved for the home and the family, but now teachers were doing that. And teachers were to protect, support, and love their students. Therefore, shouldn't they receive the same respect that biological parents receive? And then when we get to civil leaders, and as populations grew and they became responsible for protecting against lawless people, as they became responsible for maybe providing some food for the poor, as they became more and more responsible for how society was going to function, shouldn't those civil leaders receive the same honor that biological parents receive? And the Reformers said yes. Now, as an aside, I want to add to this. These insights by the Reformers of the 1500s certainly apply today when we outsource a number of things that the family used to do and was sole responsibility of the family, i.e., we outsource many times, and for some families all the time, the teaching of religion to Sunday schools in the church. Or we outsource academic education to the schools to teach to read, to write, and then math, and then higher math, and all of the rest of it from kindergarten through high school through 4 years of college. It's an outsourcing of what the family used to do. We outsource medical help by sending people to hospitals, and then maybe to nursing homes, and then to retirement homes. And the question then gets raised, shouldn't the people who work in these institutions also receive our honor and respect as we give to our biological parents? The commandment has great implications for us as God's people as we live in a society as a distinct people. Now, how do we honor? It's easy to say honor. What does that mean? And I want to go back to a discussion that we had before and say a large part of honoring goes along with what the teachings of the commandment, do not bear false witness against your neighbor. And when we talked about that commandment and as it was expanded by the reformers in the 1500s, it means we use only civil language when we talk about our leaders, be they preachers or teachers or mayors or princes or the people in our society that assume the role of providing support systems. Our language tells whether we respect or not. Our language says a lot about how we show esteem. And therefore, we're very careful when we talk about our leaders to use appropriate language that says they are important to us. In the commandment not to bear false witness, we said that was expanded to include name-calling, especially name-calling, and especially assigning names of animals to a person, and those animals are despised and disliked or hated by most human beings. They have very negative connotations. And so God's people, as they look at this commandment to honor those who provide support systems for us by never calling them a name. Oh, we can judge and we can say what is absolutely right, but this name-calling and belittling and backbiting and gossiping is completely out. And then we characterize what our leaders do, and all of those leaders we've talked about, by putting forth the best charitable interpretations of their thinking, their motives, and their acts. It didn't quite work out the way they wanted it to work out, but they were at least trying to do something good. Or their thinking seemed absolutely right. Unfortunately, it didn't work. We can be very charitable with our words as a way of honoring those who provide protection, support, and love to us. Now let's turn to the commandment, you shall not commit adultery. When the commandment was written, it was very narrow. It was written for a man not to have sex with his neighbor's wife. It was forbidden. And it was also forbidden for a woman to have sex with another man, and especially another married man. In ancient Israel, the commandment was really supported and grew because it was to protect the family. And so the way to protect the family was to forbid adultery. Then in the New Testament, Paul comes along and says, no sexual relationships until you're married. For in Israel and in the New Testament, sexual relationships are reserved in a marriage between two people. Then the commandment gets into a whole bunch of different interpretations like lust and other stuff. Now, why this commandment? What makes it connected to the commandment to honor father and mother? And the prohibition against adultery is primarily, adultery is assault on the family. Adultery destroys families. Adultery tears apart families. Adultery is a betrayal. And if the family was the primary way of support systems, and if the family even today can destroy the support system of the family, it is outlawed. It is not tolerated. It is not to be. Adultery also breaks a number of promises made when the marriage occurred. We promise to honor and to obey, to be together for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. No matter what happens, we're going to support each other. When adultery occurs, all of those promises are out the window. And we feel betrayed because we gave our word. And the other person gave their word. And now it no longer counts. And finally, adultery reaches beyond the family, the local individuals, to those outside of the marriage. It affects the nuclear family, it affects friendships, it affects us at work, it radically changes our mood and how we deal with other people. In fact, many divorced people tell me they lose trust in all of those around them, and it takes a long time to rebuild trust. And so if the scholars are right that it's not only the sexual act, but the commandment was written to preserve and to protect the family, it really should be together with honor your father and mother, which has exactly the same purpose. To sum up, the bottom line is the commandment to honor and father and mother is to support the family and all of the support systems that provide protection, support, and love. It can be religious institutions, and it also can be secular institutions. And we see adultery as an absolute threat that supports that support system. Now, before we go off to do what we need to do for the rest of the day, let me ask some questions to keep the conversation going. What were the surprises in this presentation? Was it a surprise that honor father and mother and not to commit adultery is a much broader commandment to preserve family, which was the support system in the ancient world, to supporting systems today, both within the family and within the church and then even in secular society? Was that a surprise? Or, if there were a new insight, what would it be? What made you look at the commandments? What made you look at the Bible? What made you look at a particular verse in Scripture differently? What made you think you're going to live differently? If there were statements you wanted to challenge, what are they? Would you want to challenge that sex is to be exclusive in marriage? In the 21st century, I know a lot of people who would challenge that statement. But remember, we said the commandments were countercultural. Were you surprised, and were you want to challenge that it's only in marriage that we really need to look at, and anybody who destroys a marriage is not doing God's will? And finally, if you were going to tell a friend, someone, a family member about this presentation, what would be the one thing you would say to them? Thank you for being here today. I look forward to being with you again the next time we meet.